Hey everybody, my name is Tucker.
My name's Stefanie.
Hi. Hola.
Bonjour, bienvenue.
We're here today on Big Questions, and we're talking about...
Are we actually starting to say that?
No! 2 hours later. Guys, I'm so excited about today's conversation. It's a hard one and it hits home, but today we're talking about...
Divorce.
Hit that thing. Nice! We're also talking about bitterness.
Get it.
I got it.
Nice, okay. And we're also trying to answer the question of why does it feel like it's my fault?
Ooh, that's a good one. How did it come back? Listen, today we don't have a special guest besides Stefanie because she was gone last week and we miss her. So technically you are a special guest and it is gonna be special.
It's gonna be great.
So let's talk about it on Big Questions today.
So without further ado, here's some answers to today's
Big Question.
Welcome to another week of Big Questions. This week, we're talking about divorce.
Divorce, that's
What a fun topic. Divorce, broken families. And this is something that, Tucker, unfortunately, both you and I have personal experience with. Both come from divorced families. And
What age was your parents divorced?
I was 7.
7?
Yeah.
Okay. I was it was weird. It was a long process. So I was 3 to 5. I can't really remember.
Yeah, I was kind of in the, and that's the thing with divorces, it is kind of arranged. I think that probably when I was 6-ish, I remember in first grade, I knew that something was breaking or something was happening. But I think by the time I was in second grade, that's when we did a big move and I lived with my mom then and the whole thing. So yeah. So Tucker and I both have experience with this. And so it's a topic that is, for lack of better words, near and dear.
Yeah.
Maybe not dear, but near.
It was near, yeah.
To our hearts. And so we are I'm excited. We're excited to jump into this conversation.
I think we're excited to talk about this because it's so affected our lives and we want to help those that it's also affected. And I think before we dive into, hey, how do you overcome those effects of divorce? Because divorce doesn't just affect the 2 people getting divorced. It affects the whole family, right?
And generations, really.
And generations and friendships around it. But before we get into that, I think it's important to talk about the marriage and what God has desired for marriage and how God has designed marriage. And we see in Genesis 2:25 that a man leaves his mother and father and marries his wife. That's important. And then they stay together and then they become one flesh. And then we see in 2 Corinthians 6:14 that we see that we shouldn't be marrying unequally yoked, right? That's
so expound upon that for
yeah,
people who don't
because you're thinking, man, I've been cracking eggs and
I've
I don't get it.
My whole life.
And that is a weird term though. I've always been unequally yoked. What? Basically it's someone who say it's not. What's the term? Date to convert? No, there's a term.
Never date
Don't
to convert.
do that.
Don't flirt to convert.
That's it. Don't flirt to convert. And so basically your goal in life is to not when you're getting married. Let's just talk about when you're getting married is not to find somebody and use that as an evangelistic tool, right? Your goal while you're seeking a partner, if that's what God desires for you, number one, that's important. Maybe God's plan is not for you to get married. That might be in the cards. I don't know. But as you are getting married, you got to make sure that you have the same belief systems, that you believe that Jesus died on the cross for your sins and that he rose on the 3rd day, and that you are committed together to following out his commands and his laws and living out of his love.
Something that I've told a lot of girls, I've never counseled guys through relationships, but as I've counseled girls through relationships, what I've always told them is hey, running this race of Christianity, you're sprinting towards the finish line. This is a marathon, this is a race, and you can't stop your race to meet a boy race. That's being unequally yoked, is to stop your race or run backwards to be in a relationship with someone. You have to keep running forwards, and if a guy comes along and is able to keep up with your pace, then you're equally yoked.
That's good. I like that.
So that's a good,
Equally yoked is so important Yeah, that's great. I love that. And also, Ephesians 5 talks about marriage, and it talks about how the man should love the wife as Christ loves his bride, which is the church. And then we talk about that honor in Ephesians 5, that we should honor each other if we're in a marriage. And so for Miranda and I, like, we work really hard at honoring one another, and I'm constantly asking my bros, I'm like, hey, pray for me that I can love my bride like Christ loves his bride. Yeah. And that's something that's constant. Now, we see these things, and we also, I skipped over Hebrews 13:4, and it's like not defiling the marriage bed. That's a big one. And I think in our culture today, we see this like, I want to feel good, and so I'm going to go after that. I'm going to chase after what feels good. And so, man, this relationship feels good right now. Maybe we can get married. And then you get married, and then you find out 2 years later, wow, we're not compatible at all. I was just chasing after my feels, not my life, not for my life, not trying to find a partner for life and a teammate for life. And so, yeah, making sure that we don't defile that marriage bed is so important. So that's pretty much like kind of what marriage should be. It should be equally yoked. It should be someone who you are committed to, someone that you can honor, and someone that will make you a better believer too. Will help you become a better believer.
And for life.
For
life. Right? Like this is not supposed to be something where like, oh, like I chose you and like, it felt good and we were both like rocking the Christian train and now we're not, and so now I'm done with you. Like it's supposed to be a for life thing.
And speaking from experience, only 5 years though, but like marriage isn't easy. It's not going to be easy. It's never going to be easy, because you take two sinners and they now live together and they have to figure out how to live together well.
And then they create more sinners.
And then and then you're just trying to figure out life. And so like, no, it's not marriage. Like as a Christian, it's not easy. Even as an unbeliever, it's not easy. And so that's why I believe that the divorce rate is pretty high, because people want to live easy, feel good life. That's what they want. And if it's not good, I'll just try something new. And that's what culture is telling us.
Yeah, which is really unfortunate. So like actually the statistic right now, I did some research on the Google, and right now the divorce rate in the U.S. is between 42 and 45%.
Okay.
So not like a strong 50%. I feel like we kind of hear all the time like, well, if you got two couples in a room, one of you are getting divorced. Like that's not necessarily true. And there's also been a lie that's kind of been filtered around that like Christians actually get divorced at the same rate or sometimes even at a greater rate. And those are not true statistics as well.
Well, that's kind of a praise, right?
Which is a praise, but here is something for those of you who are just like, well, I'm a Christian, so like I'm going to be good then on, like I'm going to get married and it's going to be fine. It's actually the highest divorce rate that I was able to find statistically on the interwebs. Says that it's people who are in conservative Protestant churches who claim to be Christians but don't attend church regularly, don't serve together regularly, they have the highest divorce rate. And so if you have like, these Sunday morning Christians is what, we sometimes lovingly call them, where it's like, oh, I come one Sunday every 6 weeks or something like that. Like that's actually the highest divorce rate.
Because, why do you think that's because, and we could talk about it all day, but do you think that's because of lack of accountability or lack of, I don't know, like what do you think that is?
I'm not like a social researcher, right? So I can only make assumptions, but I feel like I was about to speak something real harsh into existence.
Lack of commitment.
If you can't commit to your church family the way that Christ has called you to commit, how are you supposed to commit to another believer?
That's good, and I like that. And I think, so we talked about what marriage is and what it should be. We kind of talked about like where culture sees marriage, but what does the Word of God say about divorce?
Yeah. So this is something like, I feel like in the church we hear like, okay, we know divorce is bad. We know divorce is not supposed to be part of the plan, but what does the Bible actually say about it, and are there exceptions? Like this is something that I wrestled with. Didn't grow up in a believing household. Parents got divorced. They weren't believers. And so like, I was angry and frustrated with that situation, but didn't have this moral compass with it. And then I get into the church and I'm like, I feel so much shame because my parents are divorced and I know that it's bad, but I don't know why, and I don't know the exceptions, and what does the Bible say about it? And so it's important for us to know. Jesus only talks about divorce really once. He talks about it in Matthew 19. And basically what the situation is in this verse is that the Pharisees come up to Jesus. They're trying to like trick him into saying something bad again. Like we see this all the way through the Bible. The Pharisees are always trying to get him. And the Pharisees go up to him and they believe that they should be able to, divorce their wives whenever they want to. Like women were property, and like if I want you, that's Old Testament law. That's Old Testament. Like if I want you as my wife today, I do. And if tomorrow, like, I don't like the color of your hair, I'm going to divorce you. Like that's just what it was. And so they go up to Jesus and they're like, hey, can I divorce my wife whenever I want? And Jesus says, no. Like that is
He's
not,
a baller.
Jesus is like not dealing with
so
any of that mess, right?
countercultural.
He's like, no, like divorce is not about your feelings. It's not about your preferences. Like I've created marriage in its complete originality and what I designed it for is to be between one man and one woman, and they're the only exceptions for divorce, or the only reasons that divorce would be acceptable would be sexual immorality. So that's cheating on your husband or your wife. And I've done some research on this too, because I'm like, where does abuse fall into that, right?
Sure.
And there's some like scholars that talk about how this Greek word that talks about like sexual immorality or committing adultery against your spouse is like almost anything that you can do to damage the other person's like body, like almost. And so like abuse kind of falls into that original meaning of like that Greek word. And so sexual immorality, abuse, and then the only other time we really hear about any kind of exception for getting a divorce is in 1 Corinthians 7. Paul talks about like, hey, if you are a believer and then you're married to an unbeliever, and that unbeliever decides to leave you, then divorce is okay. But if you're a believer and you're married to an unbeliever and that unbeliever wants to stay married to you, then you need to pursue that marriage the same way that you would if you were equally yoked. And so I think basically what we see in the Bible, long story short, is that divorce really isn't okay under any, like, oh, I'm not feeling it anymore. That's not an acceptable reason for divorce. He doesn't buy me flowers anymore. She doesn't honor me the way that I want her to. Like, those aren't acceptable reasons. It's only within these certain reasons in 1 Corinthians and in Matthew 19 that we see that divorce is acceptable. And even then, sorry, I'm ranting.
That's good.
Even then, like within these, like the sexual immorality and the unbeliever like leaving, we're still called as Christians to pursue reconciliation first. It's still like, oh, your wife cheated on you. Try to reconcile that marriage first before you say it's quits. And if that wife says like, no, I don't want to reconcile, then divorce is acceptable.
Right.
So that's what we see for divorce in the Bible.
Yeah. We always want reconciliation, obviously. We really do. And especially as a kid watching your parents get divorced, you want reconciliation more than anything. And you're trying to figure out, because you're younger maybe, or maybe you're older, maybe whatever, maybe your parents are going through this right now, and you're like, how do I deal with this, and why is it my fault? And I think a lot of times we ask that question, why is it my fault? Because I think in society there's always someone to blame. But I want to tell you, like, it's not your fault. It's not your fault that your parents are going through what they're going through. It's a sin nature. Two people will have arguments with one another. That's not your fault. Two people will get frustrated with one another and lose patience with one another. That's not your fault as a child of the parents. You can do nothing to keep your parents together. You can do nothing to split your parents up. Christ is in control. And then you ask the question, though, if Christ is loving, if God is a loving God, why would he allow my parents to separate? That's a big one. That's a big one.
Do you have an answer for you?
I want to talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely.
And I want to talk about how, like, man, there are some really crappy situations that we go through. Like, there are some things that God allows us to go through so that we can grow stronger in our faith and in him. And I know that might sound like one of those answers that's like straight from the church, but like it's the best one I can give, because as you come out of that, you cling to God more because you have more of a reliance on God. If you see your parents, who you have a huge reliance on, split up and fail, all the more you should look at God and say, wow, you are an unfailing God. You are a God who will never fail me. And that's just the beautiful picture. And that is like, how do you reconcile that within your own self? It just takes time.
It does take time.
It takes healing process. It takes talking to people. But like, I really want to make it clear that like, it's not your fault that your parents are getting a divorce or that your parents have divorced.
Yeah. And God isn't like sitting in heaven being like, ha ha ha, I'm really going to show that. Like, that's not the kind of God that he is. And I think really what it does boil down to at the end of the day is that God, like, we serve a God that takes like ashes and creates beautiful things from it. And those ashes, God isn't up there like setting things on fire just to like have ashes to play around with. Like, we're the ones that create the ashes. When we're in a marriage and we let our sin get the best of us and we decide to live into our sin instead of living into Christ as our foundation, then that sin has consequences. That sin creates ashes. And so like, if you are like a kid that's had to deal with divorce, you're dealing with this broken family, like, you're not the one who started the fire. You're not the one who created the ashes, but you still are going to have to deal with the consequences of your parents' sin. Unfortunately, that's just how it works. But God is still able, if you're willing to let him, like, God's still able to restore you. He's still able to use like that, even that divorce story, for beautiful things. And I think that like both you and I could testify to that like, if my parents wouldn't have gotten divorced, there's some really incredible and beautiful things in my life right now that I actually wouldn't have had. And that's so crazy to say. But God is like continuing to restore and redeem that situation. Even, you know, like started when I was 7 years old.
Wow.
And he's still redeeming. He's still working. He's still restoring.
I know for me, when I was going through that pain of watching my parents split and thinking maybe this is my fault, the emotion more was anger. Like, what the heck? Like, you're letting me down. But like, I was so young and I wasn't a believer. And so I can't imagine for those who aren't believers, like, how do you go through this? How do you figure things out and work through these things? Without Jesus, I don't know. I really don't know.
Because like, where's the hope?
There's no hope.
And that's been like every single big question that we've had is like, we get to a point where like, if you don't have Jesus, you don't have hope in any of these situations and all the things that we've talked about. And so it really is like important. If you're listening to this today, like you randomly came onto our YouTube channel because you saw the divorce thing and you're like, I'm not a believer. My parents are divorced. I'm divorced. I don't have any hope. Like, Jesus is the only answer. Like, Jesus is the hope. Like, I before I was a believer, like dealing with divorce, like I was in some incredibly dark places. I didn't have hope. I didn't have anything. And when Jesus stepped into that situation, like, I'm just like in so much awe of what he's done once he stepped in, once he started to restore. And like, my family's still very broken and very messed up. Like, so I don't want to create the illusion for people that might be like listening or watching this, like, oh, Jesus is going to step in and it's going to be like awesome. And Jesus is awesome and he's going to step in and do awesome things. But there's never a promise of like, because I think, especially when a divorce first happens, you still kind of hold on to this hope of like, my parents are going to get back together. Like, they're like, I'm going to be enough. They're going to love me enough to get back together. Like, I know that was a narrative that I played over and over again. And so when they didn't get back together, the narrative that I've like had in my head, and sometimes I still have to work on, is like, they don't love me. They don't love me enough to get back together. They don't love me enough to actually like have us be a family.
And that's a lie from the enemy. Like they obviously they do love you. They care about you. I mean, they're your parents. I just can only speak from my experience as a parent. Like I would, you know, Marin and I, you know, that's not our path. Our divorce is never going to be in the question. But like, if that, like, I would still love my daughter. You know what I mean? Like, that's my own flesh and blood. Like, I love her so much. But that's probably the American problem right there, is that these people are like, my child's my flesh and blood. My wife isn't, or my husband isn't. But that's actually not true. If you really think about it in the way of the context of the biblical context, you see that you become one. So you're more than just flesh and blood. You are one. But that healing process had to have been hard, especially thinking through, like, am I loved? Do I matter? Am I important enough? And so you're constantly trying to fight this battle, like, if my parents get back together, then I'm good. And that's hard. That's hard to fight. And maybe some of you are going through that, or maybe some of you are going through like just anger and frustration and confusion. And how do we cope with that?
Yeah.
How did you do that?
How do we deal with these?
I remember just going into the bathroom crying for hours as an elementary schooler, and just being like having fits, and I didn't know how to control my emotions.
Yeah.
But what was it like for you?
Yeah, I mean, but pre-Jesus.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Pre-Jesus, what it was like is, a lot of crying, a lot of anger, a lot of, just fits of rage. And I think as I got older, like as I moved out of elementary school into middle school, it became like eating disorder. It became like anxiety, depression, like suicide attempts. Like it became all of these really like heavy thing. Like I didn't have any frame of reference to handle my emotion. I had for such a long time felt like because my parents didn't get back together, like they didn't love me, they didn't care about us, they were constantly fighting, they were constantly pursuing all their relationships outside of pursuing their own kids. And so it got really dark because I was trying to process my emotion outside of like Christ as my foundation. And so when I came to accept Christ, like in between like my 7th grade and 8th grade year, it was still a difficult process, but then I was able to start processing like my parents' divorce through the lens of like, okay, I know that they love me in their own kind of way, but even if they don't, I still like Jesus loves me. Jesus has got it. Like Jesus is the firm foundation. And so once I like had this like place to run to, like once I was able to run to Christ in those moments, it stopped being like fits of anger and rage and sadness and depression, and obviously like still some things that I honestly struggle with even now, but like now I can so quickly take those things to the Lord and say like, he says like my burden is easy and my yoke is like light, like give me, like cast your anxieties on me. Huge. And so I learned the longer that I'm a Christian, the longer I pursue Christ, the quicker I am to just throw, the quicker I am to just cast that anger and that sadness and that bitterness and just release it.
Yeah, I think for me, when I stopped blaming my parents for all of the bad things that ever happened in my life because of that one action, that one sin in their life of divorce, like I think I was able to finally breathe. Because I stopped blaming them, and I was like, wow, I think I need to forgive them, like myself. And I remember having conversations with my family, and just like, as I got older and more mature in Christ, like I was like, man, I get it. Like we live in a messed up world, and you guys were young, and you made a foolish mistake, and you had me, and then you're like, oh no, it's bad. Like we need to get married. And so you got married, and you thought you were doing what was right, because you weren't mature in the Lord in the first place. And so like I think for the longest time I just blamed them for all these different things that were bad in my life, and like the consequences of that. But finally when I released that, I was like, man, God has given me my own life. And my parents, yes, to an extent, like they determined a lot of things when I was a child, right? And they helped me grow, but like God's got my own path, and he is in control of it. And so I'm going to release, just like you said, I'm going to release that. I'm going to cast my anxieties, my anger to him, and I'm going to allow myself to be different from my parents, and I'm going to be better. And that's what my parents want from me. That's what all parents want for all their kids, no matter what their mess ups are. Like they want us to be better. And so how do we not make the same mistakes that our parents did? Like, what is it that we need to do right now? Maybe you're a student right now, and you're like, I don't want to make the same mistake my parents did. Let's talk about that. To you.
So I mean, what we've kind of been saying along this whole time is like the first step is like make sure your faith is solid, right? Like make sure, I remember like as I came to be a Christian, like, and still struggled with the divorce and trying to find my identity in relationships, and almost trying to like prove my parents like that I was better than them. Like, look, I'm gonna have a teenage relationship, and it's gonna be better than your marriage. Like,
that's awkward.
What like a horrible mindset to have, right? I promise you, no teenage relationship is gonna come close to the difficulty of a marriage.
No.
They're great and they're fun, but wow, I was really messed up. But
I was really messed up.
I still messed up sometimes. But in the midst of trying to make sure my faith was like solid, like sometimes I would step away from that and try to like almost prove to my parents and prove to myself that I could do relationship better. And so I would like date these guys and try to like prove myself. In the midst of that, I would lose like my faith. I would stop pursuing my faith because I was like pursuing this person and pursuing like this like bitter pursuit and this idol. And like, I wish I would have just like had someone to smack me out of that and be like, no, stop trying to find your identity in this. Like, pursue your faith. Just like give that everything that you've got. And so, yeah, number one, I would say make sure that your faith is solid. Continue to pursue that. Make sure that you know that your identity is in Christ. Be solid in your identity, which I think is really hard. Middle school, high school student, like you're in this huge period of your life where you're trying to figure, who am I?
Yeah.
What is my identity? What are like my hopes and my dreams and my pursuits? And so that's why like we're not against teenage dating. We're not against that.
I married my high school sweetheart.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Today marks 11 years that we've been dating.
Yeah. Congrats.
And we're going on a nice date.
Yeah, you are.
Today meaning Tuesday. We filmed this the day before. So.
Yeah, so it's fine.
Sorry, the 14th.
But like you really like entering into a relationship when you don't know where your identity is and who you are and what your dreams and pursuits are, like it is very rarely going to end well. So make sure you're solid. Make sure you're solid. Make sure you know like where your identity is at. Like we already kind of talked about, like make sure that you're dating someone who is equally yoked. Don't flirt to convert.
I always forget that phrase and I love
flirt,
it.
Yeah. Do not flirt. I'm going to say one more time. Do not flirt to convert.
Don't do it.
It's never going to work.
Nope.
Oh, the rhyme continued.
Turn up. We just have something here.
We just created a thing.
And I think on top of that, like don't flirt to convert is also keeping it pure, keeping your mindset pure, keeping your heart pure, keeping your flesh pure. And that's a big story of mine because my parents, like, they had an impure act and then they got married out of like, oh crap,
oh,
like
shoot,
we have to be we have to be pure. And you know, you can stop it before you get to that phase. Like you can just say, I'm gonna dedicate these teenage years in my young adulthood and my adulthood, I'm gonna live in purity. I'm gonna live in sexual purity. And what does that look like? Well, that looks like setting up healthy boundaries if you are dating, to where it's like, hey, I'm really attracted to you and I love you and I want you. And that's scary, but like that's what teenagers are saying. I was a teenager once and that's where Miranda and I were at. But you have to set those boundaries up and you have to say, hey, we're going to stay pure because we know the importance of marriage. Because I honestly still believe if you're a believer, you're dating for marriage. Like you're trying to see if this person is marriage material. And I think you can even figure that out before you start dating, which might be crazy.
I mean, for the most part, I mean, there's definitely some things that you can't figure out before you start dating, like, you know, but yeah, my last point was definitely like pursuing purity. And I was having a conversation with a friend about this topic recently, and she said something really great because I was asking her, I'm like, what are the boundaries? Like, what should the boundaries be? And she's like, that's the wrong like, yes, set up boundaries, but what you're asking when you say like, what should the boundaries be, is you're trying to find the line instead of living your life in a direction of purity. So she was like, don't find the line, find the direction. And obviously,
that's
like,
good. Say that again.
Don't find the line, find the direction.
Oh, and go in that right direction.
Because like our sinful nature when we're like thinking about purity or we're thinking about boundaries is if we find the line, we want to have one toe over it, and then we think that we're going to be solid enough to keep most of our body on the other side. And what happens is we get one toe over and then a foot, and then we have a baby. That's just like our sin nature tumbles so quick. And then we feel like we have to get married, and then like it's a whole.
It affects everything.
It affects everything. Like sexual purity in a Christian dating relationship is so important. Like so. Yeah, keep that direction. And in that direction, that means like, and I mean, hope none of our high school students should be getting to this point, but as you like, if you're a high school student moving towards college, you're in a relationship, all these things, like, it means that if you know you want to marry this person, it means you don't live together until you're actually married. Like, don't find the line. Don't think that you're strong enough. Like, you aren't strong enough. Let's just put that out there. Like, you're not. So
no, I agree.
There's that. But yeah, find the direction instead of the line.
Awesome.
And then I think like a big thing is like make sure that you have like a mentor in your life. Make sure you have a spiritual mentor in your life, because when you start getting all these crazy whacked out ideas like my relationship is the best, man, I'm the best, I'm doing such a great job with this, like you're going to have a mentor in your life who's going to be able to be like, is Jesus at the center of your relationship? Like have someone holding you accountable in your relationships now, so that when you get married and you have to be accountable to that person, you already know what accountability looks like. You already know what you need to share and what you need to say and how to ask for forgiveness and how to talk about sin and all of those things. I think if you do all of these things that we've talked about, like your marriage is not going to be not difficult, but you're setting yourself up for success.
And that's what we want for you students. And we're so glad that we're able to talk about this. And if you want to continue the conversation, we would love to continue it with you. You can email us. The link will be below. The emails will be below. And so make sure you find us. This has been incredible. And I want to continue the conversation, because I know there are some students out there right now that are going through this and they're trying to figure it out and they're hurting. So don't hurt alone. Call on us. We can help you. And remember,
you matter.